Thank you. Wow, what an honor to be here back at Sturgis Hall. And I do a lot of public speaking these days, and I still get nervous about it before I go in front of an audience. But you are a friendly group, and they're like family, many of you. We have a lot of years we've shared together, and I had the nice opportunity to have lunch with some students before starting today. And so, okay, we're going to work on the volume. I feel like new relationships are being born by having this visit here today too, and I'm honored to be invited back. I want to thank Dean Rutherford for having me as well, and the interest of the school to bring back graduates of the program I think is important, and will continue to enrich the program to engage the alumni in the work. So I wanted to title this presentation, Observations from Geneva, drawing from a recent moment in my career that became the culmination of years of learning and listening, collaboration, and advocacy. The honor to be asked by the U.S. State Department and the United States government to serve as a public sector advisor to the U.S. delegation to the Universal Periodic Review of the U.S. human rights situation last month in Geneva was an exciting moment in my career, and it brought with it both opportunity and obligation. The timing for this presentation today is actually very wonderful. I know that many of the students here are completing the semester either today or yesterday. You're in the final moments, and I hope that maybe there'll be some content in this presentation that might inspire you to integrate a human rights approach to the work that you'll be moving forward with and doing in your careers. Also making the timing for today's presentation exciting, tomorrow, December 10th, is International Human Rights Day. It's the 62nd anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is, and also America's really important relationship with the global human rights community, particularly our relationship that was forged by Eleanor Roosevelt. Today I hope that I can assert why U.S. engagement in international human rights norms is vital, why I am optimistic about this positive engagement with the international community and our own country's future in the world, and why I hope you will join me in a commitment to build a culture of human rights here in the United States. My own work is particularly focused on advancing a core human rights treaty currently, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I'm working to support domestic efforts toward U.S. ratification of this treaty. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. My presentation today is going to be pretty broad. We're going to cover a lot of topics, touching briefly on the history of human rights globally, as I said, the United States' special relationship with that movement, and particularly, again, the work of Eleanor Roosevelt. And finally, to touch on what is the human rights situation in the United States today, and what is the current dynamic between the U.S. government and the non-governmental sector, or what we'll sometimes refer to as civil society, in advancing human rights in this country. I have to acknowledge and really thank at this point my colleagues in the human rights movement. The U.S. human rights community is a big tent that is bringing in individuals who are working for racial justice, immigrant rights, migrant worker rights, workers' rights, disability rights. That's a big tent, and I have learned so much from talking with and spending time with those individuals who have invested so much in their career on advancing human rights. Particularly examples I really want to name, Wade Henderson is the CEO of the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. Margaret Huang is an excellent advocate on racial profiling in this country. And finally, Jamil Dakwar works with the ACLU. Those three really rose to the top for me in terms of how much I have learned from them, and I wanted to invoke their names here today. I should say I'm not a human rights lawyer, and often discussions of human rights really do tip into the field of law, as they should. But I am an advocate, and I can hopefully give voice to some of the issues that I think I can share with you today to raise some awareness about human rights. I hope we can have a little Q&A at the end, and I'll be happy to further go into some areas that if I gloss over too briefly today, we can go into a little deeper. I believe that, or I should say, I believe in advancing the human rights of people with disabilities around the world. And I think that that means we must advance the human rights of people with disabilities here in the United States, as well as advance a human rights culture here in the United States, raising an awareness of what are human rights. If we're to advance the human rights of people with disabilities in the USA, then we must advance human rights for everyone in the US. You know, the acceptance into the Clinton School of Public Service 5 years ago changed my life. I was working in the nonprofit sector in Kansas for the United Way, doing community volunteer work, working with AmeriCorps. And when I learned that the Clinton School was opening, and I had sensed in my career that I had sort of was, I guess I could say, hitting a ceiling in terms of my ability to advance. I didn't have a graduate degree. I was uncertain about what direction to go if I did want to return to school. And the description of the Clinton School program really fit exactly what I was looking to do. And I have never regretted the experience. It did change my life. The coursework and decision analysis, communications, those tools that I received in this program, I still draw on today. And so I think there'll be a number of times in these remarks today that I encourage the students to think about that, and the tools that you're getting in the coursework, how can you hold on to them and keep them alive in your work as you move forward. Also, the opportunity, of course, to be in a university setting and take electives. I took a lot of mine at UAMS, and those two really enriched my content-specific work, so that I was not only trying to develop my trajectory as a public servant and a solid administrator of public service programs, but also building my knowledge in this field, particularly of disability. And finally, the fieldwork experience. My experience of spending 3.5 months in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, it changed my life as well. It continues to be an experience I draw on. Those were relationships that I forged then that I continue to really value and call on in my own work. The experience of joining with a cohort of 16 other students as future public servants made this program particularly special. And at this point, I also want to acknowledge someone who's in the audience, David Deere. Where is David? Oh, there he is. Great. I don't know if everyone knows David Deere, but David is the director of the UAMS Partners for Inclusive Communities. It's a really important program going on here that is working to advance disability issues in the state of Arkansas. David is a public servant, and I learned a lot from seeing how his work with the disability community in this state was that at which I could model my own work moving forward. David also helped connect me to the Association of University Centers on Disabilities. They provided me the avenue as soon as I graduated from the Clinton School to sadly leave Arkansas, but to move to Washington, D.C. to work on disability policy at the national level. And so some of you may remember, it seemed just like that. We had our diplomas, and suddenly I was saying farewell and packing my bags, and it was rushed, but it was exciting. Within a week, it was my first day in Washington. It was the first Monday in February. That's the day the administration lays out their budget for the next federal fiscal year. And so there I was on Capitol Hill, standing in line with a lot of other interns and fellows, because all these organizations, that's who they send to go stand in the cold on a February morning to get your copy of the budget, so you can then spend the next 4 months raking over it and duking it out over the allocations. And so from that first moment, the experience of moving to Washington was one that I've valued a lot. And in talking to students today, and I will say this publicly, working in Washington with an organization where we've worked very hard to build our capacity to really be a public service organization, I hope we can continue to engage students and provide opportunities for internships and field learning experiences. So I mentioned earlier that I'm an advocate for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We call this sometimes the CRPD. The CRPD is a human rights convention intended to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights by persons with disabilities. It addresses a number of key areas such as accessibility, personal mobility, health, education, employment, habilitation, rehabilitation, participation in political life, and equality and non-discrimination. The convention embodies a change in its approach to disability, from thinking of it as a social welfare issue to being a human rights issue. Specifically, the CRPD uses a human rights approach to show how societies can remove the societal barriers and prejudices that lead to the exclusion and marginalization of persons with disabilities. Now, a convention is a legally binding document in writing between two or more countries. We call this a multilateral convention because multiple countries can join this treaty. Convention and treaty, those are really synonyms in terms of international law. A convention can be written to address all kinds of topics. A human rights convention is a convention that deals specifically in the topic of human rights. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is a human rights convention, and it's the first human rights convention of the 21st century. The CRPD does not create any new or different rights for persons with disabilities under existing international human rights law. Rather, the CRPD defines existing international human rights norms through a lens of disability. Why was this convention needed? There was an invisibility of people with disabilities in the international human rights system. That even though people with disabilities theoretically had the same human rights as anyone else, as countries were reporting on their own advancement on human rights issues or being aided by non-governmental organizations to advance human rights in their country, people with disabilities were often falling through the cracks of those programs because of the diversity of the disability community. And we bring in, obviously, a very broad constituency. For example, the deaf community, the blind community, children with disabilities, and their families. Because of that diversity, it made it very hard sometimes to identify how are people with disabilities not being integrated within a broader human rights advancement. Existing human rights treaties didn't offer any guidance on people with disabilities, and they were seldom applied to people with disabilities. And reports to treaty monitoring bodies, such as those that occur at the United Nations, seldom address disability issues. And so, inspired largely by the United States because of what we accomplished 20 years ago with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the global community said we have to move forward on equalizing the status of people with disabilities. And to do that, we need to create an international framework, an international language, so that all countries can have an understanding of these issues. And so in 2001, Mexico, on the floor of the UN in the General Assembly, called for a drafting process to work on a treaty. This process occurred then from 2002 through 2006. And unlike a historical approach to drafting treaties, this wasn't a back room, just a few attorneys around a table hammering out about what a treaty would look like. This was an inclusive process that included people with disabilities, not only through non-governmental organizations, but also as representatives of their own countries coming to the table. This created unprecedented access for disability civil society, or what we'll sometimes call DPOs, Disabled People's Organizations, to be on the floor of the UN contributing to this treaty. This positive involvement of disabled people in a UN process changed how the UN does business today. It's now more accessible and more inclusive. In 2007, the treaty opened for signature, and on that, in 2007, the treaty opened for signature. Over 80 nations and the European Commission signed the treaty on that first day, breaking the record for a human rights treaty. In May of 2008, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities entered into force upon its 20th ratification. We'll get into in just a moment a few of what these technical terms mean, but on the just final comment about the content of the treaty. It's cross-disability in approach. There's no definition of disability within it. Rather, it's grounded in a social model of disability, the interaction of an individual with their own unique abilities, combined with those societal and barriers can create discrimination or marginalization that the treaty works to describe how to alleviate. The treaty focuses on monitoring at all levels. Individuals with disabilities, where do they experience discrimination or marginalization? At the local level, where they are. And yet, as we know with human rights treaties, international and national advancement is so vital to moving forward. And so monitoring through this treaty occurs at all levels. The principles and obligations of the Convention are consistent with concepts of independent living, inclusive education, universal design, self-determination, and other approaches to disabilities. This treaty contains the most elaborate description also of international cooperation in any human rights treaty, because it really acknowledges the role of non-governmental organizations in advancing human rights, in building capacity in any country, in building infrastructure development in countries. So as we know, and I think we talked about this a lot when I was a student here at the Clinton School, the future work opportunity for public servants outside of government, in the non-governmental setting. This treaty really describes how non-governmental organizations are a key player in global development. Very exciting for advocates in the United States was when candidate Barack Obama announced one day that it was his vision that the U.S. would sign the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The U.S. does not always join treaties, and we certainly do not always join human rights treaties. So this was a big step for a candidate to make that pledge. On July 30th of 2009, he fulfilled that pledge. On the 19th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, President Obama signed the ordered signature of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And he is supportive of the U.S. becoming a states party. And so here are a few of those terms that I wanted to describe. A country can sign a treaty, and that's your country saying that we believe in the vision of this treaty, we will not do anything to compromise it or to impede its development around the world, and we support what this treaty says. Ratification of a treaty, however, says that we as a nation will work to actually bring our own domestic laws into alignment with the vision of the treaty. You may be aware that ratification of a treaty requires a 2/3 majority vote in the U.S. Senate. This is often a frustrating component in our process here in the U.S. to treaty ratification. We have a number of other human rights treaties that have been signed but have never been ratified. Another example would be the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. That treaty was signed, I believe, under President Carter and still sits unratified in the U.S. Senate today. They have never been able to achieve that 2/3 vote of support for ratification. Because of this administration's pledge for increased engagement on international human rights issues, advocates for the Women's Treaty, or CEDAW as we call it, are really fired up about the prospects to move the treaty forward in the Senate. To move a country toward ratification requires an introspective review of our own domestic laws to see what's the vision of the treaty and where are we, and is there a gap that we must address. That process is now being undergone by the Obama administration, where they're looking at what does the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities say, and where are we? We have this Americans with Disabilities Act, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we have the Rehabilitation Act. All of these laws seem to put us in alignment with where the treaty is. Can we achieve ratification? That's why I'm on the edge of my seat, waiting for the completion of the Obama administration's analysis, because where they come out on that process will then inform what are they asking of the U.S. Senate. Are they asking the Senate we can ratify this without change to domestic law because we already have a wonderful set of domestic laws that have us in alignment with the treaty. Or they come forward and say, if we ratify, we're going to have to close that gap by working on legislation in particular areas. That latter option, of course, can be frustrating as well because any piece of legislation to move on Capitol Hill can take years. And so to be able to close a potential legislative gap could mean a fair amount of work. Our analysis of the treaty at the U.S. International Council on Disabilities is that the U.S. is in alignment with the convention and that ratification of the treaty will not require changes to domestic law. You know, disability legislation has moved forward in the U.S. historically because of bipartisanship. Things like the ADA, and just 2 years ago, the Americans with Disabilities Act amendments passed with bipartisan support because disability is understood as not a right or left issue. It's understood as one that touches every aspect of society. Every family can have the experience. Any individual at some point in their life may experience disability themselves. And so we're hopeful that a vote for ratification can occur in the Senate with that same spirit of bipartisanship. Ratifying the CRPD will give Americans with disabilities more ways to engage in an inclusive and accessible world, to share experiences with people with disabilities around the world, to work and travel abroad, because they can anticipate that barriers are falling, accessibility is increasing, and that the opportunity to travel to another country may now be possible. The convention is an affirmation of the rights of Americans with disabilities and a revival toward better implementation. I talked about the vision of the CRPD. The Americans with Disabilities Act is also a vision, and 20 years in, we have not fully realized the vision of that law yet ourselves. Employment rates for people with disabilities, for just one example, are still terribly low in this country, despite the supposed equality of individuals with disabilities in the hiring process or in the workplace. Finally, ratification of the CRPD provides the United States an opportunity to participate in an international monitoring process. Sometimes we'll hear criticism that international monitoring bodies on human rights treaties don't include us. Well, you have to ratify the treaty to be able to sit in the monitoring body. So if we can ratify this, we as a nation can then nominate individuals to be on those monitoring bodies. After 20 years of the ADA, more than 20 years of IDEA, we have a lot to share with the world about disability. And I want to see my country at that table, helping to advance the human rights of people with disabilities around the world. So I believe that ratification of the CRPD is the American thing to do. The extensive support for the CRPD around the world will help to establish greater inclusion of persons with disabilities in a wide variety of contexts. The United Nations estimates that there are 650 million people with disabilities globally. Approximately 87% of the world's population now resides in countries that have signed or ratified the CRPD. There is no internationally accepted definition of disability, as I mentioned, and the CRPD does not include a definition of who persons with disabilities are. However, the CRPD approaches disability as an evolving concept, which results from the interaction between people with different functional abilities and societal obstacles, such as physical barriers and attitudes. In other words, it's these barriers that are disabling for people, not their impairments or different functional abilities. The more obstacles and barriers a person faces, the more disabled they become. Under the CRPD, persons with disabilities include but are not limited to those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments such as blindness, deafness, impaired mobility, and developmental impairments. President Obama emphasized the importance of the core goal of the convention on the day he ordered signature, and he said, disability rights aren't just civil rights to be enforced here at home, they're universal rights to be recognized and promoted around the world. Secretary of State Clinton concurred in saying that supporting rights are among the most important guideposts of our foreign policy. They are also values that unite us as Americans and bring us together in common purpose with people in every country and on every continent. After decades as a global leader in the civil and human rights of persons with disabilities, the United States is now reconnecting with the international community by affirming the basic human rights of all people with disabilities and positioning us to better contribute our expertise on the global level. Secretary Clinton further said, "I'm going to make sure that this convention is reflected in our policies around the globe, and to that end, I intend to ask our Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor to make support for people with disabilities a central element in the State Department strategy worldwide, to ensure that we carry out the Obama administration's goal of spreading opportunity and standing against injustice whenever and wherever we see it." Secretary Clinton affirmed what Americans with Disabilities have long been calling for, that the values enshrined in the Americans with Disabilities Act be reflected in our nation's policies and practices abroad. USAID believes that the U.S. signature of the CRPD is a monumental step toward realizing this vision, and one that must be furthered by swift U.S. ratification. Within a year of the signing, the U.S. State Department under Secretary Clinton announced that Judith Heumann had been appointed to the special advisor on international disability rights. Judy Heumann, some of you may remember, served in the Clinton administration as the Assistant Secretary of Education, and during the Bush administration years led the World Bank's disability program. Today, 147 nations have signed the treaty, and 96 countries have ratified. Particularly notable in that list is the ratification by developing nations and countries in the global south, where there has not been widely a history of disability rights. And so for so many nations, ratifying the treaty is their first step in establishing equal rights for people with disabilities in their country. They're taking that step of ratification first and then working to build a more just society. President Obama's leadership in this movement toward U.S. ratification has been very important. I want to commend those advocates around the world who have led their own countries toward ratification. We can gain valuable insight from countries around the world that were the front runners in the ratification process. I think also on this topic of advancing disability rights, I want to acknowledge someone else who's in the audience today. Billy Altham is the Executive Director of the Association of Programs for Rural and Independent Living, or APRIL. APRIL is working around the United States to advance opportunities and to eradicate barriers for people with disabilities in rural communities, not only here in Arkansas, but around the country. And his work and support for this treaty has been very important to us, so I thank you for being here. So I want to switch a little bit and talk now in a more general sense about human rights. What are human rights? Human rights are rights under international law that apply to individuals. Everyone is automatically entitled to enjoy the full range of human rights just because they're human. International human rights are established and defined in treaties like the Convention and in other UN resolutions, but most significantly go back to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. Following the horrors of 2 world wars, a group of men and women gathered under the auspices of the newly formed United Nations to draft the first International Bill of Human Rights. This concept, if not the broader UN formation, was controversial at the time. President Harry Truman added to the controversy here at home by choosing to include Eleanor Roosevelt to participate as a delegate in the first General Assembly of the UN, then held in London. Historian Marianne Glendon of Harvard has written that Eleanor Roosevelt was a, quote, reluctant delegate. She, not considering herself distinguished in foreign affairs compared to the other delegates who were assigned, but she was passionate. This occurred in her life at age 62, and so she accepted this assignment and later wrote, "I took this assignment because it seemed I might be able to use the experiences of a lifetime and make them valuable to my nation and to the people of the world at this particular time. I know, of course, how much my husband hoped that out of war, an organization for peace would really develop. It was not just to further my husband's hopes, however. It was rather I myself had always believed that women might have better chance to bring about the understanding necessary to prevent future wars if they could serve in sufficient numbers in these international bodies. It was the culmination of a lifetime of engagement in humanitarian and civil rights issues for Eleanor Roosevelt. Subsequently, the world community at this new United Nations named Eleanor Roosevelt as chair of the committee to create the International Human Rights Commission and draft an international bill of human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt later said, after the processes had completed, "Where do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world." I think there's an echo in this understanding of where are universal human rights in small places close to home. We can see in disability rights, as I described earlier, where do individuals with disabilities experience discrimination, marginalization, where they are. The election of President Obama was an encouragement to the U.S. human rights community because he was saying things in his campaign speeches that really encouraged a sense of moving the human rights agenda forward in this country. Likewise, just earlier this year, Secretary of State Clinton said in what's now known as the Krakow speech on human rights that she supported not only that we are advancing human rights in this country, but the importance of civil society, non-governmental organizations, citizens organizations to do this work. I want to read a quote from her. She says, "It doesn't matter whether the goal is better laws or lower crime or cleaner air or social justice or consumer protection or entrepreneurship and innovation. Societies move forward when the citizens that make up these groups are empowered to transform common interests into common actions that serve the common good." As we meet here on the eve of our American 4th of July, the day when we commemorate our independence, I want to say a word about why the issue of civil society is so important to Americans. Our independence was a product of our civil society. Our civil society was pre-political. It was only through debate, discussion, and civic activism that the United States of America came into being. We were a people before we were a nation, and civil society not only helped create our nation, it helped sustain and power our nation into the future. It was representatives of civil society who were the first to recognize that the American colonies could not continue without democratic governance. And after we won our independence, it was activists who helped establish our democracy, and they quickly realized that they were part of a broader struggle for human rights, human dignity, and human progress. The civil society movement for advancing human rights in the United States, I described earlier as a big tent. It's robust, it's full of young people, old people, diversity. All of the issues that concern them are broad, and moving forward the human rights agenda in all of its breadth will take time. There's a vital organization here in the U.S. called the U.S. Human Rights Network that serves as a big tent to bring together the human rights community and all of its diversity. Their executive director, Ajamu Baraka, has said, "Underlying all human rights work in the United States is a commitment to challenge both the belief that the United States is inherently superior and the belief that neither the U.S. government nor the U.S. rights movements have anything to gain from the domestic application of human rights. U.S. human rights network members believe that the U.S. government should no longer be allowed to shield itself from accountability to human rights norms, and that rights movements stand to benefit, perhaps now more than ever, from an end to U.S. impunity in this regard. I have seen with the Obama administration, their engagement of civil society has upheld that. They have worked very closely to listen to human rights advocates, to gather what their concerns are, and to bring those concerns to an international process that I'd now like to describe for you, and that is the Universal Periodic Review. The Universal Periodic Review was established by the UN General Assembly in 2006 as a process through which the human rights records of the 192 nation members of the United Nations could be reviewed and assessed. This review is conducted through the UN Human Rights Council, of which the United States is now a member. This review is based upon human rights obligations and commitments expressed in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and human rights instruments, such as conventions and treaties, to which the state is a party. The United States is a strong supporter of the UPR process and provides a unique the UPR process provides a unique avenue for the global community to discuss human rights around the world. Individual countries are slated for review every 4 years, and the United States was scheduled for its review in the 2010-2011 UPR. UPR sessions take place at the Human Rights Council in Geneva and are framed by reports submitted by national governments. The United States submits its own self-assessment, its own report, to the High Commissioner in August. This report reflects input collected during an extensive program of consultations with the American public. For about a year in advance of submitting our own national report, the Obama administration traveled the United States listening to civil society about their observations of human rights in this country in order to craft its own self-reflective report. But the role of civil society must be one of advocates. And so the civil society groups also submit their own reports in a shadow way to the official government report, where they can look more in depth at those issues for which their constituents that they serve, and also to work in a way that may push the administration further. So this UPR process really is a dynamic one that involves three groups. You have the government, civil society, and you have international diplomacy. After this phase of listening around the country and crafting reports, the advocacy community can then also take their issues to international diplomacy and visit with other countries and say, ask my country, why are we at this point in this particular issue? So, for example, advocates for the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women can ask another country in the UPR, ask the United States government, why have we not ratified that treaty? The listening sessions that were held around the country were really amazing. For just a few examples, the U.S. government went to New Mexico and Arizona to hear about border issues. They also visited with Native American tribes to learn and hear from them. They visited New Orleans to learn what issues had been exacerbated in a post-Katrina society. They visited Birmingham to look at the astounding homeless situation in that city. They visited Detroit and Dearborn, Michigan to learn about the situation of American Muslims. All of this information compiled then into an official national report to the international community, self-assessing our human rights situation. I think, let me quote the Obama administration. In submitting their report to the UN, they said, "There is much in this report for which we can be proud. At the same time, we have challenges to overcome and problems that are not yet solved. We must continue our effort, a future envisioned by Eleanor Roosevelt, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., President John F. Kennedy, and many others who have propelled the United States toward an ever greater respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. With the submission of the official report from the United States to the UN, Secretary of State Clinton said, "The United States is a leader in protecting the fundamental dignity of all people, including our own. We are proud to participate in this universal periodic review as one more demonstration of the importance the United States places on protecting the basic human rights of Americans and promoting those same rights for every person, everywhere." Over the course of the last 2 years, as I've been advocating for U.S. ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I increasingly was meeting with other human rights advocates and meeting with federal government officials who are working in these human rights areas. And so I was quite surprised at the end of October when my phone rang and I was asked by the U.S. State Department to serve as a public sector advisor to the U.S. government in this UPR process. This would mean going to Geneva with the federal government representatives for the UPR session at the UN. I was one of 3 individuals who were put into this role. I'd like to acknowledge my civil society colleague, Zainab Al-Sawaj. Zainab is the executive director of the American Islamic Congress, so she was also invited into this role. And finally, Robin Toma. Robin is the executive director of the Human Rights Commission of LA County. And so, because this is a national level dialogue, to bring someone who's working in human rights at a county or city level, I thought was good, and it was a good move on the government's part to bring in that perspective as well. And so the big day arrives in Geneva at the UN, a big room as you would see on the news of, you know, all the chairs and sort of these round crescents of countries with their country plate, and all of the delegates show up. And your own country, because it's your review day, you can bring a nice big party of folks. And up at on the stage in front would be your leadership. And so for our government, representing the United States, were 3 assistant secretaries of state. Secretary Harold Koh, who's the legal advisor to the Department of State, Secretary Michael Posner, who's the Secretary for Democracy, Rights, and Human Labor, and finally Secretary Esther Brimmer, who is the Secretary for International Organizations at the Department of State. They are then joined by the U.S.'s representative on the Human Rights Council, and that was Ambassador Eileen Donahoe. They take their seat, the rest of their staffs all sit in seats behind them or wherever we could fit, and we civil society advisors were sort of we found a place for ourselves as well. And then a 3-hour dialogue begins where countries around the world had actually probably sent their interns the night before to sign up to see how quickly they could get the mic the next day. And it was quite amazing because some of our countries' allies and also many of our critics had really worked hard to get a chance to make a statement about their observation of human rights in our country. So for example, Venezuela and Iran were some of the first countries to make statements about how they see the U.S. human rights situation. And so over the course, each country has 2 minutes to make their statement. And so one country speaks and then another country, and the country who's under review can stop the process at any time of their choosing and allow for an intervention where they say, okay, let us respond to some of what we have just heard. And so when you sort of let the dialogue go for a while and it becomes a little mixture of some harsh criticism with some more encouraging remarks and everything in between, because certainly our allies, many of whom are parties to many of these international human rights treaties, are encouraging our country to step up and join those bodies as well, and they said so. As I mentioned earlier, American civil society spent a lot of time working with those country delegates to educate them about their perspective on human rights in our country, so that they could hopefully ask a question that would advance that issue for that constituency. And so it was really a fascinating process when a country has 2 minutes and only what actually comes out of their mouth goes into the official record. So they read it very, 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 very fast. And oftentimes with a translator going on, it really creates this sort of cacophony of someone reading in their own language and then translation in your headset. And I have to say, this was a dream come true in my career to participate in an international dialogue of this importance. I think that the U.S. government really did a nice job in addressing issues head-on, accepting where there was criticism and not shirking it. I think they had some good defenses in areas that they're working to move forward in. And this is an ongoing dialogue. Now that the live discussion on the floor has ended, the U.S. government will now craft a formal response back to the world community, looking at these, probably grouped into about 18 issue areas. But over the course of that 3-hour dialogue with the world, over 200 recommendations came out of other countries. And that's a key thing in international law, apparently, is they have to use that word recommendation. They say, we recommend the United States ratify the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. That was exciting for me to hear. It's also interesting to see, because every country has their own turn at some point, where they're on the hot seat, those issues that they chose to bring up, they have to politically weigh, will that come back to haunt us down the road when it's our turn? And I will also say that it was interesting, we didn't see it a lot, but there were certainly a number of countries who raised the issue of equality and discrimination against gay and lesbian people, and that was exciting to see. So let me summarize very quickly in terms of recommendations. The largest groups of recommendations from the world community to the United States were, one, to join the international human rights treaties, to join those norms on human rights. Or in the case of treaties that we have ratified, to withdraw any reservations that we have attached. It gets us off a little bit into the weeds, but when a country ratifies a treaty, you can attach, essentially it's like a signing statement to the treaty. You can call it a reservation or an understanding or a declaration, where it's your country saying, well, we ratify this treaty, but it's our understanding that this may mean this in our context. Sometimes countries will use that as a strategy to water down their obligation under the treaty. And so advocates do push for the removal of those sorts of reservations. Another issue that was largely discussed that day was the death penalty in the United States. Race was discussed, disparity in sentencing based on race, disparity in educational outcomes based on race, racial profiling in law enforcement, religious profiling in law enforcement. Immigration issues, addressing concerns about detention and discrimination against immigrants, racial and ethnic profiling. Also economic discrimination. I mentioned discrimination against the gay and lesbian community. Also discrimination based on race and gender. Economic, social, and cultural rights. I sometimes call those ESCR. The U.S. government responded on this concept of social rights. And social rights, let me boil that down and maybe oversimplify it a little bit, but we say that in the social compact, if we're coming together as a society, then society should provide everyone some basic social protections. And so the U.S., in responding to criticism that we don't necessarily acknowledge economic, social, and cultural rights in our country, responded about the new health care bill, that this effort to afford everyone the opportunity for accessing health care is a step toward achieving social rights in our country. There were recommendations from the world community regarding national security. Most of these recommendations referred to our country's continuing armed conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Finally, one of the most common recommendations that came from the world community was around our implementation of human rights. In the United States, we do not have what's sometimes called an NHRI, or a National Human Rights Institution. This can be an independent but government-funded body who looks at human rights in your country and engages in these interactions with the world community. Certainly the diverse American human rights community has been calling for that for a number of years. We have a commission on civil rights in this country, but we don't have a commission on human rights. There's some frustration with the commission on civil rights, and so there's a diverse community pushing for the concept of reinvigorating our civil and human rights in this country by establishing a national human rights institution. There's also encouragement to President Obama from the advocacy community to issue an executive order to initiate an interagency working group on human rights. There was one under the Clinton administration that went away, and under President Obama, advocates are hoping that we can bring that back. If federal agencies can collaborate with each other on how the human rights situation in the United States is being monitored and advanced, greater traction can be achieved. Finally, the final call, I think, from advocates to the U.S. government is that, okay, we've done this UPR process, we've heard from the world community, we're writing our national response to these suggestions and recommendations. It cannot stop there. We must move the human rights ball forward in this country, or this will have just been a very expensive 2-year-long exercise for the federal government to travel the country listening to people, to go to Geneva, to listen to the world community. But if we don't begin taking steps toward improvements, then why did we go through the process? My final section of remarks, I want to hopefully tie to this by going back to an experience I had as a Clinton School student, and that was the fieldwork I did in Vietnam. I worked there with disabled people's organizations on the ground to build their capacity. I mentioned earlier civil society, and what we sometimes refer to disability civil society. It is a vital component to advancing human rights for people with disabilities around the world. Governments cannot and will not do it alone. They need their own citizens to be moving that ball forward with them. We take that for granted in some ways in our country because our civil society is so robust that American citizens are our government, and we are doing this work. So it was exciting and an honor to have that opportunity in Vietnam. As Dean Rutherford said in my introduction, I did end up 2 years after completing the Clinton School program, I got that paper published that was the output of my work in Vietnam, where I surveyed people with disabilities on the ground about their experiences, their hopes, and their dreams, and was pleased to find a publisher for that in a compilation of global disability perspectives. And so then I thought, well, that's kind of it, and I'm still in touch with folks from Vietnam, but that's the work is done. But it's not. I was pleasantly surprised when 2 weeks ago I received an invitation to attend a roundtable at the State Department yesterday with some of those same figures who had participated in the Universal Periodic Review, specifically to discuss human rights in Vietnam. This created an opportunity to reach out to old colleagues in Vietnam, to meet with other advocates here in the U.S., including Vietnamese expatriates who are living here, who are working to create a more open society in Vietnam from abroad. And working to, in the UPR process, I talked about how advocates can go to other governments and say, ask my government about this. We had the same opportunity with the State Department yesterday to say, while you're in Vietnam on this visit, diplomatic visit, ask the Vietnamese government about these particular sets of issues. And so this is an encouragement to the students in the room to hold on to the experiences that you're having in your fieldwork. It may lie dormant for a while, but it may come back too, and it's exciting when that happens. And this is then my segue into just a lot of unrequested advice to Clinton School graduates. And I want to encourage you to envision that guide star in your career I didn't realize that this was where I was going to be ending up. I didn't realize that I would be working on human rights issues when I came to the Clinton School. I was working in Kansas at the community level, and I figured that'd probably be where I would go next. But I had a vision for the capacity of people with disabilities in American society, and that fed a vision for the equality of people with disabilities around the world in their own societies. And so with just that general sort of vision, a trajectory just naturally unfolded from the first day of walking into the Clinton School to then arrive back here 5 years later. You can do your public service in the government or the non-government. Just bring passion to that work. If you chose as I did, and I didn't realize I was going to end up in Washington, D.C. Washington is a really amazing town. It's fatiguing, it's frustrating sometimes, but it's also inspiring because of the diversity of issues at play there and the really talented folks who have come to that town. Washington is definitely a town about relationships, but it's always been my position that those relationships should come naturally and not be forced, not to trip over yourself at cocktail parties so you can get that face time with that particular person or get in the elevator with someone. It's not my style. I tend to step back a little bit and rather hope that my reputation for hard work will carry me forward. I think if you build this image among your peers that you are a hard worker, those senior to you will see that and new opportunities will come to you. Finally, I want to make a few requests of these future public servants in the room. One is, of course, about inclusion, that the programs and initiatives that you undertake in your career will always be inclusive of a diverse society. Not only people with disabilities, but people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds, people of different economic situations. Also accessibility. Look at the programs and the initiatives you're doing. How are they accessible to marginalized populations? How are they accessible to people without economic means? How are they accessible to people with disabilities? Make inclusion part of your work. Finally, I want to close with a quote from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. I'm sort of blending Articles 21 and 29 here, but it says, "Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country, directly or through freely chosen representatives. Everyone has the right to equal access to public service in his country. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government, expressed in genuine elections by universal and equal suffrage, held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. Everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his or her personality is possible." The integration of public service as a human right. I hope today that I may have raised and expressed why promoting and protecting human rights are the American thing to do. Tomorrow is the International Human Rights Day, every year on December 10th. I'm optimistic about the future of human rights in this world, and I hope you'll join me in building a culture of human rights in these United States. Thank you.
We've got time for a couple of questions. Here's one right here, Bob.
Hi. I'm Daniel Whalen. I teach international relations at Hendrix.
Great.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Sure.
I have a question for you about the communities that you work with in the U.S. and their advocacy for the Convention on People with Disabilities. Mm-hmm. Given the fact that we have other treaties that have been sitting around for quite some time, CEDAW, probably the worst example is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which and the only other country in the world that hasn't ratified it, doesn't have a functioning government. So do you think it's wise to advocate for that treaty alone, or to try to bundle these treaties together, which is what Carter tried to do in '79?
Sure, right. That's a great question. Thank you. I think it's, there's a couple aspects of this. One is I firmly believe that my work to advance the CRPD is part of advancing a culture of human rights in the U.S. In terms of political process, if we can move the CRPD through a ratification process, that actually I think is going to help prepare the Senate to move some other treaties forward. We are close colleagues and allies with other treaty advocates. We've learned so much from them, particularly the CEDAW advocates. They've been at this for decades. And so as the new treaty on the block, we've learned a lot. In terms of political processes to bundle the treaties, that's been proposed. I mean, if the Senate Foreign Relations Committee comes to us as advocates and really puts that on the table, then we're happy to talk about that. At this point, I think that the strength of our advocacy is that each individual coalition who have really drilled down on that particular issue, bringing their expertise into the room on that issue is going to move the issue forward most expeditiously. Also, the Senate hearing process in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is one that, while bundling would not be impossible, it would potentially further extend the process. And I think, again, we might be more expeditious on our current track of pushing for ratification of the CRPD.
Yes, sir. We have a question right there.
Hi, I'm Mobatia. Mr. Morrissey, it seems to me like some of the countries who have ratified this treaty are not necessarily known as, I guess, strong advocates of people with disabilities, or countries
Absolutely.
with less funds. So why is it that the United States, who's supposed to be a leader in the rights of people with disabilities, and frankly with a lot more economic funds to actually implement it, is hesitant to ratify it?
Yeah. A treaty like the CRPD includes some equality statements about the equal rights of humans, and in this treaty's case, the equal rights of humans with disabilities. If your country ratifies that, you begin implementing it right away. That you send the message, you implement the laws within your country to eliminate discrimination, to eliminate unfair treatment. That's very different from another aspect that's wrapped into the treaty, which are more around social, economic, and cultural rights. So, for example, if we talk about the right to housing, in a country where no one has housing, if the housing situation is bleak for everyone, the country can't just snap its fingers because it's ratified a treaty and be there today, suddenly we have all this wonderful housing for disabled people. Disabled people are going to move forward with everyone else. So one phrase that we see throughout the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is on an equal basis with others. That as society moves forward, people with disability move forward on an equal basis with the rest of society. So for a country that is still in development, a low or middle income country that really is just trying to develop some infrastructure for its broad citizenry, ratification of the treaty says as we move forward, we're not going to leave disabled people behind.
Ms. Abrams, wait for a minute. Let me get you this microphone.
Number one, I want you to know that you validated the investment of human capital in being here in this School of Public Service. And secondly, you validated the value of the UN as a former delegate, non-governmental delegate to the UN. We have a lot of people who really think the UN is not necessary anymore.
Yes.
And particularly in other countries that we don't really know their culture. How do you think that we can continue to have this cultural development for the discrimination and all of the big tent that you talked about? You're coming here. How do you think it has helped us to have a better understanding of the value of the UN, of the value of this Clinton School, through people like you?
Oh, thank you. Well, it's a shrinking world, to be sure. Increased communications and travel are connecting citizen to citizen. And citizen diplomacy is happening outside of these formalized bodies like the UN. And I think in some ways that vibrancy, that civil society dynamic is where the real important work really is going on. The UN, I will say, I think it is a valid body. I think there is still a role for it. I want to see my country at that table. Certainly the US government under the Obama administration had some criticism that we even went to Geneva to sit through 3 hours of criticism. I would propose that if we do, then we'll have our chance on the other side of the aisle to help move human rights forward for other societies around the world and building a global culture of human rights. So by stepping up to the table, I think we're doing that. Does that address? Okay.
I've got time for one more question. Right here, Henry.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for being, David, for all that I ever felt you could be.
Oh, thank you.
As one of the, what I always refer to as the Clinton School 16.
Yeah.
We have the Little Rock 9, we have the Clinton School 16, the first class. Your presentation is silent on one issue that maybe I missed.
Sure.
And that is the difference between the signature on the treaty and the ratification. In the Senate getting a 2/3 majority. Does this imply that there are funding issues, monetary issues on the Congress?
Great question.
If they ratify versus if they only?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Could you?
I absolutely can.
Just a moment.
Yes. I said that our analysis at the International Council on Disabilities is that the U.S. is in alignment with the treaty, and so to ratify should not require additional expenditures. As we begin visiting Capitol Hill to talk with Senate staff and senators about why we support ratification, that's a question that is coming up a lot. Well, if we ratify this, what is it going to cost? And our position is that we made the commitment to costs when we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. We made a commitment to inclusive education when we passed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The treaty reaffirms those commitments, but does not create new obligations for us to spend within. We're still looking, as I pointed out, to achieve the vision of our own domestic laws in those areas. Thank you.
Well, schools can be proud of people, and we've sure got one today that we're proud of. Ladies and gentlemen, David Morrissey.